I agree.
This is Dr. Berman.
Thank you. I just wanted to comment specifically to your question. My interpretation with being glad to be modified is that the size and duration of any studies that would be assessed, would be performed, would depend on adverse clinical event trials and might vary accordingly. So I think giving an exact size and duration isn't possible at the present time, but there was discussed at the meeting and there were ranges.
Thank you. Do we have another question, please?
Yes, when question 3 was modified, you added something to the line that says in a cardiovascular trial or significant body evidence, or I can't recall how it was reworded. What is meant exactly by that? And is this just integration of phase 3 data?
I'm going to attempt to answer that question. Yes, it was modified, and as if you were there in the audience, you probably note that there was some change up to the slides. Well, I don't have the actual question as it was written, but what it meant here is that first, whether or not one should impose just one single study, a prospective study. There were several members on the panel who suggested alternatives to perhaps providing us some degree of reassurance that risk, an acceptable risk, or a rule out of an increase for cardiovascular risk can be performed other than through one single study. And because of that, that's why the question was modified. Now, the alternative could have been a result of just pooling, and again I use the term pooling in quotes, of trials that are prospectively planned in such a way that you can adequately combine them to assess cardiovascular risk. Currently, that it wouldn't be the case because, as you heard from question 1, companies are not adjudicating for important cardiovascular events, and that certainly impairs our ability to detect these events and provide some clarity to these events. So the alternative here is looking at the current program with respect to clinical trials in glycemic control, perhaps also enrolling more patients at high risk, and then combining that to get a sense of risk on cardiovascular disease, as opposed to doing a single study in a single patient population to rule out that risk.
So would you get more from this than what you will get from your standard ISS?
I'm sorry, what was that standard what?
Integrated summary of safety.
From an ISS, where you have to do an integrated analysis of your safety data?
I think that the answer would be yes, because currently, with the integrated safety summary, these are not trials that are designed to specifically look at cardiovascular risk. So at a minimum, these trials would have to be better designed prospectively to evaluate that.
This is Dr. Jenkins. Let me add to that as well, because the question as it was modified really came down to asking the question whether a drug that does not have a signal identified so far in the phase 2, phase 3 program should be required to develop data that would allow us to adequately and with comfort assure ourselves that it doesn't have an unacceptable cardiovascular risk. And the committee didn't specifically define what the unacceptable level of risk would be, but they clearly voted that they wanted us to require studies that would give us that assurance, although many of them voiced support for the concept that some of that information could be provided before approval as a screening method to rule out a significant increase in unacceptable risk, and then after approval they might be able to confirm that. The way the trial was modified, as Dr. Park said, was in response to some committee members' nervousness that we just focus on one cardiovascular trial versus there may be alternative pathways by which you could achieve an equivalent level of confidence that you've ruled out an unacceptable cardiovascular risk, and that's why the question was modified. But I think the important point was that we heard they wanted us to have greater certainty and assurance before approval about the cardiovascular effects of the drug, and that they wanted us to ensure that the question was ultimately answered either before approval or after approval to better understand cardiovascular risk. That's a shift in the expectations of what we're asking for today. It's a higher level of understanding and a higher level of assurance that you've excluded an unacceptable cardiovascular risk.
Can I give one example of the difference between what we do now and what we might do later? Now, typically, after a relatively short-term study, say a 12-week study, lots of people will be crossed over to the active drug, so they'll get long-term data on that drug. The trouble is, they get long-term data on the drug, which is good for rare events, but it doesn't really give you any good comparative data. So, and this was discussed, what they might do instead is continue the two groups as randomized out to a year and a half, or whatever, giving you data that could be informative about relative risk if you had several studies of that kind. So the existing database, pre-marketing, might become more useful for that kind of comparison than it now is.
Do we have another question in the room, please? Kathy Larkin with Bloomberg.
Can you summarize the panel's recommendations for existing drugs and how you understood the differences they wanted to see for different types of drugs and newer drugs versus older drugs that are already on the market?
Well, even with that question, there were some different recommendations there. One particular recommendation was it really perhaps need to be focused on the newer therapies and not so much on therapies that are already available as generics or older drugs. There was also very thoughtful discussion as to looking at what we already have, what information, because as you know, as you heard, there have been numerous clinical trials already conducted in patients with type 2 diabetes with a lot of these therapies. And although they may not have established evidence of benefit, those studies may have been sufficient to rule out harm. And for those drugs with that kind of data, it may not be necessary to go back and look at it. It really will ultimately require us to look at each individual drug and the amount of evidence that is currently available for those drugs. And if we feel that it's not adequate, it's insufficient, then we may have to ask for additional data.
And we have a follow-up.
Brian Marson, the Pink Sheet. If you choose not to ask sponsors to clinically assess approved drugs, could you describe some of the pharmacovigilance options that you might pursue to focus in on those to identify these issues?